All right, we've taken a look at the succession of George W. Bush to the presidency, following in his father's footsteps, and of course, after two terms of Bill Clinton, uh, some of that last term of Clinton's, of course, racked by scandal, particularly because of the Monica Lewinsky incident, leading, of course, to his eventual impeachment. But uh, compromise reached, and he did not get removed from office by the United States Senate. Keep in mind that when Clinton leaves, and I've mentioned this to you a few times, that he leaves with over a 60% approval rating. If there's one common thread between him and Bush, it's going to be this word, and that is communication. I mentioned that before, particularly in our Zoom session, but we found that Bush's failures, which begin after 9/11 and his superb handling, really, uh, of that incident. But after that, his lack of communication skills are going to doom him to a largely unpopular yet two terms in office. He will run again in 2004. He will beat the nominee for the Democratic Party, John Kerry, decorated Vietnam War vet, uh, unlike Bush. Uh, so Bush wins. So people were relatively happy with him. Now, is this a carryover from uh, 9/11 and a refusal to really look at what was going on in his administration? Well, let's take a look at why he was, first of all, incapable of communicating. Now, again, keep in mind 9/11, Osama bin Laden, uh, everybody was right on board. But as it turns out, uh, Bush and unfortunately his advisors, most of them holdovers from his father's uh, years in office or the Reagan years in office. They did not, it would appear, particularly Vice President Dick Cheney, did not respect Bush's grasp on many of the issues, particularly concerning foreign policy. Cheney, it seems, and again, I want to underscore that it seems, uh, really was the one that directed the policies that were going to be put in place in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Most Americans supported the invasion of Afghanistan. That's where Osama bin Laden was. He was, of course, sheltered by the extremists, the Taliban, who had taken over Afghanistan. And so, under the quote unquote Bush doctrine, we're going to go wherever bin Laden is. And so we invade, both to get rid of the uh, administration there, which harbored terrorists, and of course to get bin Laden. The problem would be that Cheney and others, and Bush is among them, he was not a total babe in the woods when it came to this, started to uh, look at Iraq and made ties between Iraq and 9/11. There was none. There were no ties in that particular regards. There was no connection between Iraq and Osama bin Laden. There was no uh, connection that Iraq and Saddam Hussein kind of fathered the blowing up of the World Trade Centers. But that was the impression that was left with many American people. And it simply was not true. Uh, so in 2003 2003, we invade Iraq. Many people, much of them to their later regret in Congress, voted for it. And again, uh, the now Secretary of State, Colin Powell, who of course had been the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when George H.W. Bush had kicked Iraq out of Kuwait, Colin Powell warned Bush against this. He said, if you invade, then you own it. Then Iraq is yours. Bush and his advisors did not admit that. They felt that they could immediately export democracy into Iraq and that everything would be fine. That, of course, was not going to be the case. Second term, he is constantly going to be defending his decision to go into Iraq because remember, they were looking for WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. None were ever found. This was the excuse for invading Iraq, that they were going against the treaty, which ended Gulf War I, and that they were hiding weapons of mass destruction. Totally untrue. This was going to be, however, the justification for the invasion of Iraq. This is what was presented before the United Nations. And of course, it was completely untrue. To this day, nothing has ever been found. And that's what Bush is constantly going to be defending. His inability to concentrate will be put on display with a domestic incident, Hurricane Katrina, one of the worst hurricanes ever to hit the United States, devastated the Gulf Coast. This is when the entire city of New Orleans is going to be flooded. Thousands will die. Tens of thousands will seek refuge in the New Orleans Superdome. And then Bush, totally out of touch, tells the director of FEMA that, Brownie, you're doing a great job, which seems to totally ignore the devastation and all the lives that were lost down there. So Bush's popularity rating, his approval rating, is going to drop to the bottom of the barrel. Take a look at Bush's mangling of the English language.
And so, in my State of the Union, or my speech to the nation, whatever you want to call it, speech to the nation, I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully. And America needs a military where our best and brightest are proud to serve and proud to stay. If you're a single mother with 2 children, which is the toughest job in America as far as I'm concerned, and you're working hard to put food on your family, rarely is the question asked, is our children learning? Too many good docs are getting out of business. Too many OBGYNs aren't able to practice their love with women all across this country. See, I don't think you can be. There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, fool me once, shame on you. You fool me, we can't get fooled again.
Is our children learning? Well, that's a good question, considering today's atmosphere of COVID and all this online learning. But be that as it may, is our president a good speaker? And again, his inability to communicate. I've said this before, I'll repeat it again. All of the great presidents had that in common. They could communicate. Lincoln, George Washington, actually, not a great speaker, but was able to effectively communicate his ideas through others. FDR, the ultimate communicator, and others that would follow in that footstep. Bush could not. And then near the very end of his term, the country, his second term that is, the country gets plunged into an economic nightmare.
And so,
as a result of that, and of course the unpopular wars in both Afghanistan now and Iraq, because of course we never did get bin Laden because we pulled resources away from that fight in order to invade Iraq. The first Black president in the history of the United States will be elected. And that, of course, is Barack Obama. Obama is and was a communicator. And his election, of course, not only because of the racial implications, but because of his view of America, was totally different than what had taken place in the past. Fortunately for him, in the beginning, the Democrats controlled not just the presidency, but also the Senate and the House of Representatives. That would not last long, unfortunately. Mitch McConnell, who to this day is now in control of the Senate because of the Republican domination, said on Obama's inaugural day that his one job and the job of all Republicans was to make sure that Obama did not get reelected. Now, I want you to think of that. Pledging themselves on the first day of his inauguration to put a roadblock into anything that he's going to try to do. And of course, in many respects, they did. The ACA, or of course, the Affordable Care Act, but to this day known as Obamacare, is one thing that manages to get through. However, much of what was contained in the original bill is going to be slashed because of the necessity of compromising with the Republicans. But nonetheless, Obamacare goes in and unfortunately has a horrendous rollout. And what I mean by that is the technology that was necessary in order to implement this. And I'm talking about a computer program that could sign you up and immediately assign you to a healthcare provider crashed because so many people tried to sign up originally. So it was not a good look for the initial public's view of Obamacare. Obama will come in during the beginning of the Great Recession that started under Bush. And he is going to have to take in some instances, some rather unpopular stances. He's going to bail out some banks that he called too big to fail, that if they had gone bankrupt, then the entire economy would have been kneecapped. And so the government steps in and lends money. Initially criticized by many, including a new voice in the Republican Party, that of course being Donald Trump, but it proved to be the right move. And all of those banks have paid back the government and then some. He will bail out the auto industry. They were all about to collapse, with the exception of Ford. And once again, jobs were the key there. And then in Afghanistan and Iraq, he announces a pullout date for Iraq. Now, there were a lot of people that were opposed to that, and in some instances, because of the rise of ISIS near the end of his administration, that was deemed a mistake. However, they had already, prior to his assuming office, had set a date by treaty with the new Iraqi government as to when the United States was going to pull out. So if they break that treaty and don't pull out, you can imagine the diplomatic consequences. In Afghanistan, of course, he starts to wind it down and then is talked into initiating what's called a surge. More troops go in there. And of course, eventually in 2011, the death of Osama bin Laden. But with all this, you have the rise of something that still causes many problems today, the rise of the Tea Party. These were Republicans. They were extremely conservative. They take their name, of course, from the Boston Tea Party and rising in revolt. And anything that smacked of Obama, anything that looked to them to be liberal, they were against. That will help them take control of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And of course, Obama is on defense for the rest of his second term, which he wins, of course, against a challenger from Utah, Senator Romney. So all of this now leads us to the election of Donald Trump. And that's something that the history books are still out on. Take a look at what was accomplished under Obama. Much of it would be dismantled by Trump simply because he didn't want Obama to get credit for anything. Regulation of the banks, that's been done away with. Fuel efficiency standards, that's been done away with. The nuclear agreement with Iran, that's been done away with. And again, in each one of those cases, They, his own advisors and foreign nations begged him not to do this. But, uh, you know, during Obama's early administration, you remember that Trump is the one that fueled what becomes known as the birther controversy, arguing that Obama was not a natural born United States citizen, which of course was totally false. Imagine that, Trump saying something that's totally false. And so that ends our romp through U.S. history 2. And I wish you a lot of luck with the final test, which will be on the 18th. And please sign in for the Zoom meeting, which will be on the 16th. And I will review all those questions. And if I don't get a chance to say it, I'll say it now. I hope you have great holidays. Stay safe and enjoy.